Good afternoon, fellow Earthlings. Here we are on our planet Earth, surrounded by some 200 billion stars of our own Milky Way galaxy. And on out in the universe, there is an estimated 100 billion other galaxies, each one containing several hundred billion stars. And sometimes when we look at the stars at night, we are reminded of some really important questions. What is our human place in the universe? Are we humans alone in the universe? Who are we humans, really? And those questions are at the core of the reasons for doing a Humans to Mars mission supported internationally. And I'm talking about sending humans, not robots. And if we do that, it will lift human life to a higher level of authenticity. It will cultivate a global human identity core. It will increase our human self-esteem and confidence. It will share mission costs with other nations, advance peace, and reduce military spending. It will encourage worldwide science education. It will create jobs and prosperity. It will foster a more mature and wiser human civilization. And it will produce authentic novelty and excitement to inspire all humanity, and I think even more than a Texas Longhorn football game. Now, Stephen Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, had something to say about this. He said that the effort to understand the universe is one of the few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce. And we do play a lot of games. We need to take time out from our games once in a while to do something serious. This Calvin and Hobbes cartoon also speaks to this matter. Calvin says, look at all the stars. The universe just goes out forever and ever. And then Hobbes replies, well, it kind of makes you wonder why humans think they're such a big screaming deal. And then Calvin replies, well, that's why we stay inside with our appliances. And we do that a lot. We stay inside with our appliances and watch television and computer screens. And closely related to that is the fact that 2/3 of the people in North America cannot see the glow of the Milky Way galaxy anymore because of our own human-made lights. And you could say that we're hiding in our own light, both philosophically and factually speaking. But the good news is that some benefits will be immediate when we make the decision to do something like exploring Mars or next door neighbor planet to understand ourselves and the universe. And how some of those benefits will be immediate is explained by Nathaniel Branden in his book, Psychology of Self-Esteem, where he writes that the only authentic basis of self-esteem is an unbreached determination to use one's mind to the fullest of one's ability and a refusal to ever evade one's knowledge or act against it. And one of the best ways, or perhaps the best way, to use our minds to the fullest is to use the results of science, or to do science. And that can be done in basically 3 ways. One is to predict and influence nature to produce life-enhancing technology, such as cell phones, air conditioners, computers, and robotic farm machinery. And the list goes on. We have surrounded ourselves with the results of science and technology to where some of us could not survive without it. A second way is to produce weapons to threaten or kill other humans. And we've been doing that a lot lately. A third way is to search for human meaning and identity. And this is the way that science began several centuries ago. But we've largely pushed that aside in the last century or so in favor of the first two. However, The good news is that there has been some resurgence lately in using science to search for human meaning and identity. And a good example of that resurgence is a book entitled Science and the Quest for Meaning. It's written by Alfred I. Tauber, who is the Boston University professor of philosophy, and he also is the director of their History of Science program. And in that 2009 book, he wrote, "The role of science in defining personal identity cannot be overemphasized." And basically what he's saying is we should return to using science in a more humanistic manner in order to determine something about our place in the universe and determine our human identity. The slide got left out. Werner von Braun had something to say about this. As you know, he is the brilliant rocket scientist that designed the Saturn V rocket that sent us to the moon in 1969. And he said that by going into outer space, we will find ourselves. In other words, by exploring beyond our own planet Earth, we will discover something new about our human identity. Now, what is human identity? Well, it's obviously made up of many, many different factors, but the major ones are gender, race, ancestral origins, language, nationality, occupation, religion, and for some of us, our football team, and our place in the universe. Now, what does exploring Mars have to do with our human identity? Well, discoveries about Mars would add to our perception of our place in the universe. And obviously, one of the key questions is about life on Mars. If we were to discover a DNA life form on Mars, that would mean we're probably related to it and could possibly have descended from it, and in a sense, we could even be Martians. On the other hand, if we were to discover a non-DNA life form on Mars, that would mean that there's a good possibility that other life forms have evolved commonly throughout the universe and that we're not alone. And our place in the universe is at the core of our human identity, which in turn is a powerful influence on our behavior. We behave according to who we think we are and what we think we can do. Now, I have just one tiny little example of how human identity can work. And the Pastor Terry Jones of the Dove World Outreach Church apparently felt that his identity, his religious identity, was threatened by the mere existence of a Quran. So he held a public burning of the Quran back in 2011 in Gainesville, Florida. And right after that, people around on the other side of the world in Afghanistan apparently felt that their religious identity was threatened by that burning of a Quran. And they responded with protests and killings and suicide bombings. And unfortunately, that's going on and on, even today. Now, Amartya Sen from India, who won the Nobel Prize, wrote a book back in 2006 entitled Identity and Violence, and he kind of summarizes this whole phenomenon. And he wrote that many of the conflicts and barbarities in the world are sustained through the illusion of unique and choiceless identity, and that the result can be homespun elemental violence or globally artful violence and terrorism. But the good news is, he says, the solution to this is to see ourselves as planetary citizens, and that a global identity can begin to receive its due without eliminating our other loyalties. In other words, we can see ourselves as planetary citizens, but retain our nationality, our religion, and our language, and all of that. Now, I made a cartoon here to reflect the most common thing I hear when I do this presentation, and I've done it 35, 40 times, I can't remember exactly. But it's two guys talking on the Earth. The first one says, before we waste money on sending people to Mars, we need to solve problems here on Earth. I've heard that any number of times. And the second guy says, yeah, we need to wait until we're finished killing each other with trillion-dollar wars to prove whose God is really God. And I'm afraid we're actually doing that. We spend a lot of money on weapons and war. And I think, well, there is a recent Pew report developed in 2012 that showed that religion-related terrorism violence exists in 1/5 of the 198 countries and territories of the world. 1/5. That's probably a conservative estimate. And another completely unrelated report has said that there's a narrative going around in some circles that the United States entered Iraq and Afghanistan in order to destroy Islam. Well, I don't think that's true, but I think when we send things like drones over to certain places to kill certain people, I think it increases those kind of perceptions. And here's a chart that I got some time ago. It's the proposed 2013 federal discretionary budget. Shows that the military uses 60% of that budget compared to NASA's 0.6%. Huge difference. Another way to compare what we spend on space exploration is to look at the salary of Charles Bolden, Chief NASA Administrator. He receives $179,000 per year. That's a decent salary. However, compare that to the starting salary of Charlie Strong, the Texas Longhorn football coach. He receives $5 million per year. If only we are as interested in space exploration as we are in football, we would already be on Mars. Now, way back in 1960, Marshall McLuhan saw all of these communication satellites being launched around the world and interconnecting the entire world in instantaneous global communication. And he coined the term global village. And not too long after that, the astronaut Edgar Mitchell kind of confirmed what McLuhan was saying. Mitchell said that seeing the Earth from space produced instant global consciousness, and I came back to Earth no longer an American citizen, but a planetary citizen. And several other astronauts have reported the same kind of thoughts, including a Saudi Arabian astronaut. And Jill Carter, who is an astronomer and been involved in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence for several decades, has made the statement that we are all Earthlings. We owe it to each other to celebrate our commonality rather than our perceived differences. And this is a common theme about people who think about what lies beyond the Earth, people involved in space exploration and astronomy. And there was a report, a study done back in 2008 that showed that more and more people, especially younger people, are seeing themselves as planetary citizens. But when we went to the moon in 1969, it was pretty much just a race between the United States and the Soviets. And when we got there, we planted the United States flag on the moon. But I think it would have been much more beneficial and more diplomatic if we had planted the flag of Earth on the moon, just as they're doing here at the South Pole in the Antarctica. Now, the Reverend Dr. Fraser Watts, a Cambridge professor of theology and science, I think that's a really interesting combination, made a statement back in 2006 that science is the most genuinely international movement in the world order and therefore a force for peace and stability. And a good example of international cooperation in science is the Large Hadron Collider. It's located near Geneva, Switzerland. It's supported by 60 different nations, costs about $10 billion, and the United States is part of that. And about 2 years ago, they announced that they found the fundamental particle of the universe, the Higgs boson particles. And this kind of scientific research will enable all humanity to better understand how the universe actually works from a scientific viewpoint. Now, on the other hand, we humans compete in many different ways. There's global competition in products and labor. We've been operating in a global economy for several decades. And there's competition for NASA contracts, including who will give the next shuttle ride for astronauts to get up to the International Space Station. And who would you guess about the contract to manufacture this NASA pin that I have on my lapel?
China.
Exactly, it's China. China makes everything. But a mission to Mars should not be a competition between nations. For one thing, it's pretty darn expensive. If we really want to do it well, we need to split the costs up with different nations. And the United States could still lead and coordinate such a mission if we don't sit around too much longer. Otherwise, a large country like China might do that. Now, Martin did some research on cooperation. He had an article in the July 2012 issue of Scientific American entitled "The Evolution of Cooperation." And in that article, he wrote that instead of opposing competition, cooperation has operated alongside it from the get-go to shape the evolution of life on Earth. In other words, we humans are as successful as we are because we have evolved to cooperate as well as compete. And we need to remember that. And Catherine Newell lectures on religion and science down at the University of Miami, Florida. And in the February 21st, 2014 issue of Science magazine, she asked a very important question. She asked, what would happen if the exploration of the real frontier of Mars was portrayed as a triumph of global scientific cooperation? And that's exactly what I'm suggesting that we proceed to do. Now here's something I found very surprising. John M. Logsdon wrote a book back in 2010 entitled John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon. And he discovered that in 1963, Kennedy proposed sending representatives of all countries to the moon with a global approach to space exploration. And that he asked at one point, why should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Unfortunately, he was assassinated when he was in the middle of negotiating with Khrushchev to do this. And the NASA Ames Research Center did something called the Next Generation Exploration Conference back in 2006. And it was made up of mostly younger people. And one of their major conclusions was that international collaboration is not only vital to sending humans to Mars, but should be one of the most important reasons for going in the first place. In other words, if we accomplish nothing else by sending an internationally supported mission to send humans to Mars, we should do it in order to bring nations together in cooperation and perhaps reduce some of this ridiculous conflict that we have going on. And Paul Hill and Robert Caswell and Michael Rafferty, all major leaders in space exploration, have indicated to me that international cooperation in space exploration is essential to sending a humans to Mars scientific mission. And there are lots of examples of international cooperation going on in space exploration now. I've listed 8 here. I will only cover 2 or 3. The International Space Station has 16 nations aboard. The Russians have been providing transportation to get up to it, and Europeans and Japanese are transferring cargo to it. And about 3 years ago, the Chinese asked to be included. They wanted to join, but the United States Congress excluded China, saying they would be a security risk. I believe the largest populated nation in the world would be worth the risk. And the Russians at one point asked to have a joint humans to Mars mission with the United States. We should have taken them up on it. And the Mars One, a non-profit private organization to send humans to Mars, the last time I checked their website, showed that they had collected a little over $500,000. But I think the key point is that they've received citizen donations from 94 different countries around the world. And that tells me that probably a lot of people around the world are interested in sending humans to Mars. Now, I did a brief survey back in the summer of 2012, about 2 weeks before the Curiosity rover landed. I approached people on the streets at random in northwest Arkansas, and I asked them if they knew what was about to happen on the planet Mars. And 47 people out of 50 didn't know anything about the Curiosity rover. And that tells me that a humans to Mars mission would gather much more interest than almost any robotic mission. Now, Jeffrey Bennett, an astrophysicist who spoke here earlier, he spoke here yesterday. He has written several books about astronomy, has written that a little perspective on our place in the universe makes any form of geographic, ethnic, or religious hatred seem just plain ridiculous. And that we can grow up and solve our problems only by exploring the universe beyond the Earth. In other words, we're not ever going to become a truly wise and mature human civilization until we explore beyond our own planet. And Dr. Bennett also agreed with me that an internationally supported mission to Mars is a good idea. So, an international mission to Mars should invite every nation to participate at whatever level they're capable of, and every continent needs to be represented by a crew member, and all the proceedings need to be translated into all the major languages of the world so that everyone feels included. And it could be the ultimate live television report from the crew, perhaps a half-hour live report on a daily basis as they leave the Earth, approach Mars, walk on the red dust of our next-door neighbor planet Mars, and then begin to return to the Earth. I think such a live report from the crew would inspire all humanity. So an international humans to Mars mission can improve life on Earth in these ways. Lift human life to a higher level of authenticity, cultivate a global human identity core, increase our human self-esteem, share mission costs with other nations, advance peace and reduce military spending, encourage worldwide science education, create jobs and prosperity, and produce authentic novelty and excitement to inspire all humanity, and in the end, foster a more mature and wiser human civilization. Okay, did I have a question?
I'm wondering why you think the global outreach trumps the small. Many of us here are married. If there's any married person here who's been married very long and hasn't had a fight with their spouse, I'll be surprised. Most of those don't get violent. But there's a natural tendency when you want to do things one way and somebody else want to do things another way to argue about it and try to win. And my husband and I are both here because we both love space exploration. it hasn't kept us from having those little fights.
But
What's the link?
you have not, either one of you apparently have not killed each other.
No,
And what I'm talking about is reducing the violence. I'm not saying we all agree to think the same way. I'm saying if you think a certain way, don't pick up a gun and kill somebody just because they're thinking differently. And that's what's going on today. In fact, there was a report on CNN this morning that said one side was saying in the Middle East, I believe it was Iraq, saying either convert or we will kill you. Yes.
In regards to the questions, how can you convince, I'm a young generation, how can we convince the older generation today that have the power and the authority to make decisions the way forward, that war is not the way, it's peace, and like what you said, let's explore space. Second question is, when humans land on Mars, who will have the control or the authority to say do what and do not? Like, what you can do this, you can do this.
Well, I would think that we would decide that before we send the issue out. To answer your first question is, I'm probably older than you, and I'm convinced of the peaceful aspects of an international support mission to Mars. But yeah, you have to have reasonable people get together and decide, you know, what's going to take place when you get to Mars to some extent.
okay.
You don't